Welcome, everyone. My name is Joe Sabia, and on behalf of Global Action to End Smoking, it's truly my pleasure to welcome you to our August public webinar titled Exploring the Intended and Unintended Consequences of Electronic Nicotine Delivery Systems Policies. We'll be together for approximately 1 hour today discussing cutting-edge research on nicotine vaping in the United States. In a moment, I will introduce our panelists, but first I want to thank you, members of our live audience, for being here. We hope that the research you hear about today will inspire your interest in this most important policy area at the intersection of economics and public health. And we hope you will participate. As you listen to our remarks and presentations, you should feel free to click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen and type in your questions for us. While we will try to answer them for you in writing in the final 10 minutes or so of our webinar, we will do our best to orally answer as many questions as we can. And thanks in advance for your participation. And now for our panelists. First, Cliff Douglas is President and Chief Executive Officer of Global Action to End Smoking, a nonprofit independent grant-making organization dedicated to ending the illness and death caused by smoking. Previously, he directed the University of Michigan Tobacco Research Network and was a co-investigator for the University of Michigan's Center for the Assessment of Tobacco Regulations. He also served as the American Cancer Society's National Vice President for Tobacco Control. During the Obama administration, he served as the Tobacco Control Policy Advisor for the U.S. Surgeon General and was the lead author of Ending the Tobacco Epidemic, a Tobacco Control Strategic Action Plan for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Chuck Kortemanch is Associate Professor of Economics in the Gatton College of Business and Economics at the University of Kentucky and is Director of the Institute for the Study of Free Enterprise. He is a health economist and applied microeconomist with research interests in the economics of tobacco, obesity and nutrition, health insurance, COVID-19, and big box retailers. He has published his scholarship in leading economics and health policy journals, and his work has been funded by such outlets as the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Agriculture, the Food and Drug Administration, and Global Action to End Smoking. Chuck is the lead author of the Southern Economic Journal, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a research affiliate with the Institute of Labor Economics. Caterina Muratori is a research associate at the Center for Health Economics and Policy Studies at San Diego State University and will soon be joining the University of Barcelona. Caterina received her PhD in economics from the University of Torino in Italy, and her research lies at the intersection of health economics, economic demography, and labor economics. Her work has been accepted for publication at outstanding journal outlets, including the Journal of Human Resources and the Journal of Health Economics. Finally, I'm Joe Sabia, the chairman of the Economics Department and director of the Center for Health Economics and Policy Studies at San Diego State University. I am a health and labor economist with research interests in the economics of risky behaviors and public policy analysis. My research has been supported by such outlets as the National Institutes of Health, the Social Security Administration, the Charles Koch Foundation, and Global Action to End Smoking. I'm a research affiliate at the Institute of Labor Economics and serve on the editorial boards of the Southern Economic Journal and Contemporary Economic Policy. To begin, I would like to turn the floor over to Cliff Douglas, who has some opening remarks for us. Cliff, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joe. I want to add my welcome to everyone here today. Let me start by, again, thanking our expert colleagues who have generously volunteered their time to share their latest research findings. I also want to express my appreciation to you, our attendees, who have joined us to share in these learnings. We have a very nice live turnout, and of course, more will be able to benefit later from the recorded version of the webinar. And as always, a special thanks goes to those of you who are participating during late night or very early morning hours, since we have people coming here today from a great many places. On behalf of my organization, Global Action to End Smoking, I'm pleased that we have these three distinguished scholars with us who will address the cutting edge topic of the intended and unintended consequences of ENDS, or electronic nicotine delivery system, policies on youth. In recent years, the rise of e-cigarette use among youth in the US has, of course, raised concern and sparked significant debate among public health experts, the medical community, researchers, decision makers, schools, parents. And while these devices were introduced as a tool to help people who smoke, particularly those who could not or would not otherwise stop smoking, to minimize their risk by moving down what the Food and Drug Administration and others refer to as the continuum of risk. The increase in vaping by young people in 2018 and 2019 in particular, those are references to the US, raised serious concern for a lot of folks. While youth vaping has since plummeted, at the same time that youth cigarette smoking has fallen to historic lows. And that's a dramatic tobacco control success story that doesn't get the attention it deserves. Many governments have responded by implementing policies aimed at curbing vaping by both youth and adults in ways that have themselves raised concerns regarding their actual impact on health behavior. Now, based on their timely research, our speakers are going to explore with us some of these policy impacts, examining not only their intended effects, particularly reducing youth vaping, but also the unintended consequences that appear in some cases to have resulted, including increases in lethal smoking. This work should help inform further research and the related work of nonprofit organizations and others as we continue to navigate this complex landscape of tobacco control and the complementary area of tobacco risk reduction. So with that, I'm delighted to turn it back to you, Joe, to get things started with a presentation on the impact of e-cigarette retail licensure laws on vaping by youth. Thanks to all of you again.
Thank you so much, Cliff. Greatly appreciated. So the format going forward will be that each speaker will take about 15 minutes to present some of their policy relevant research, and then we'll have some time at the end of the webinar to orally answer some of the questions that members of our audience may have. So I will begin with the first talk. So this work is joint with my colleagues, Chuck and Katerina, who are here, and our colleagues, Yang Liang and Catherine McLean. I couldn't ask for a better research team with whom to collaborate. In this paper, my co-authors and I asked the question, do e-cigarette retail licensure laws reduce tobacco use? Our team is excited to announce that this study was just accepted for publication at the Journal of Health Economics, and just yesterday was actually released in its in-press version online, so you can go online to read the full version of this paper. This work was also supported in exploratory stages by the National Institutes of Health and by Global Action to End Smoking, which helped bring the paper through completion. So the introduction of ENDS products in the U.S. tobacco market beginning in the late 2000s and early 2010s certainly had a substantial impact on youth tobacco use. Between 2011 and 2019, there was a substantial rise in teenage ENDS use. In 2011, about 1.5% of U.S. high school students reported prior month ENDS use. That number rose to about 28% by 2019. This prompted the U.S. Surgeon General at the time to assess this high rate of youth ENDS use to be an epidemic. Now, it's true that, as Cliff noted, since 2019, there's been a substantial drop in youth ENDS use, owed in part perhaps to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as policy strategies that were specifically targeted at reducing teens ENDS use, including the imposition of a federal Tobacco 21 law, which raised the minimum legal purchasing age for all tobacco products to 21, but perhaps also due to other policy strategies, including the one we're studying in this paper, licensure laws. Maybe some states and localities also implemented flavor restrictions that Chuck is going to talk about. Katerina is going to talk about increases in ENDS taxes. All of that could have played a role for this decline. But the blue line is representing sort of the trend in nicotine vaping among high school students in the National Youth Tobacco Survey. So there you see the big rise between 2011 and 2019 before the drop subsequently. The orange line is showing you trends in prior month cigarette smoking among high school students, which has been dropping faster than many public health experts predicted. In 2021, less than 2% of U.S. high school students smoked cigarettes. And one question that has been raised, at least during the 2011 to 2019 period, is whether some of the decline in cigarette smoking could be explained by some teens turning to ends if the two products were substitutes. Now, this gets us thinking about what the counterfactual is to a teen using ends. If in the absence of access to ends, teens would have abstained from all tobacco products, then clearly increasing access to ends among teens is going to lead to worse tobacco-related health outcomes. Moreover, if increased access to ends for teenagers begins teens on a lifetime path of nicotine addiction that includes so-called gateway effects to combustible tobacco products or even other substances like alcohol and marijuana, then there may be also some adverse long-run health consequences of access to ends to teenagers. On the other hand, if some teens substitute to combustible cigarettes when ends access is restricted, then the net effect on tobacco-related public health may be ambiguous and could in fact be negative. For instance, there is growing evidence that increases in ends taxes and the imposition of minimum legal purchasing ages for e-cigarettes specifically may induce substitution towards cigarettes among youths. And to the extent that e-cigarettes generate much less tobacco-related health harm than combustible tobacco, then maybe ends use is an effective tobacco harm reduction strategy, even for teenagers. Now, while many policies designed to curb youth ends use have focused on the demand side, such as raising ends taxes, this study that I'm going to talk about explores the impact of a prominent supply side strategy, the imposition of e-cigarette retail licensure laws, which I'll call ELLs. So since 2011, 33 states and the District of Columbia have adopted an electronic cigarette licensure law, which requires tobacco sellers to obtain a state license to sell e-cigarettes over the counter. Now, license fees can range from trivial amounts, minimum fees of about $5 in Montana, for example, to more substantial fees on the order of like $800 in Connecticut, and some of them may be annually renewable. There are penalties for non-compliance, which could include suspension or revocation of a business's license to sell e-cigarettes, fines that can rise as high as $25,000, and even criminal sanctions. So what are ELLs designed to do? Well, they're designed to regulate sales and increase compliance with state tobacco regulations, including minimum legal purchasing ages for e-cigarettes and scanner ID laws. Ultimately, the goal is to reduce the supply of e-cigarettes available to local consumers with a particular eye on youth. ELLs also may offer some, quote, support to retailers, that is encouraging vendors to meet with on-site inspectors to ask questions about selling e-cigarettes and to ensure that the signage about sales is appropriate. Now, it's true that many public health advocates see licensure laws as a vital anti-vaping policy tool. The U.S. Surgeon General in 2018 issued an advisory recommending that states and localities adopt licensure laws to fight vaping among youths. So ELLs could reduce youth ends use through a couple of channels. One, maybe through encouraging stricter enforcement of other e-cigarette laws, like minimum legal purchasing ages, or by influencing the price and availability of e-cigarettes. Some sellers may choose no longer to sell e-cigarettes if a license is required that is costly. Some of the costs of compliance could also be passed along to consumers. Both of these things are likely to raise the local prices of e-cigarettes. And if we think youths are particularly price elastic, then we might expect them to reduce e-cigarette use. On the other hand, if the cost of obtaining a license is relatively low, or ELLs don't actually promote greater enforcement of e-cigarette laws, then maybe ELLs are going to have little effect. We know that license fees are typically relatively small. Compliance checks may be relatively infrequent. It's also true that youths typically don't rely on direct purchases of e-cigarettes from retailers, what ELLs are designed to target. For example, if we look in the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, among youth vape users, only about 20% directly purchase their own e-cigarettes from a store. The vast majority are getting their e-cigarettes through the social market from, say, bumming or borrowing e-cigarettes from other people, or getting them from the illicit market, or maybe from the internet. So it could be that the informal social market for e-cigarettes may help isolate teenagers or insulate them from the effects of e-cigarette licensure laws. So our study is going to be the first to comprehensively look at the effect of ELLs on nicotine vaping. We're going to explore maybe differences in effects of these laws by how strict they are. We're also going to see whether their effects differ based on how youths typically obtain their e-cigarettes, and then look beyond the effects of licensure laws on just e-cigarette use and also on combustible tobacco products. So no states had an e-cigarette licensure law in 2011. Here's their staggered rollout across states and over time. 2 states had adopted by 2013, by 2015, 17, 19, and 2021. This is the geographic and temporal variation in e-cigarette licensure laws that we're going to be exploiting in our empirical model. This slide is giving you a sense of the strictness of e-cigarette licensure laws. Those states that have relatively higher fines for noncompliance, relatively higher renewable licensure fees, and are likely to impose criminal as opposed to, or in addition to, civil penalties for noncompliance. We'll also look at the effect of licensure laws that have these particular qualities. The main data set we're going to be using to look at youth ENDS use and youth combustible tobacco product use is the state youth risk behavior surveys. So these are data that are representative at the state level of youth behaviors, and can also be made representative at the national level with respect to 14 to 18-year-olds. Between 2015 and 2021, we've got data on prior month ENDS use, including the number of days of nicotine vaping. For some auxiliary analysis in which we look at the effect of licensure laws on adults, we use data from the Behavioral Risk Factors Surveillance System Survey, or the BRFIS. The estimation strategy we're going to be using is a difference in differences model. We start off with a so-called two-way fixed effects model. That's the TWFE. The left-hand side variable is going to measure ENDS use among high school student I residing in state S at time T. Our key right-hand side variable is going to be whether the state has adopted an e-cigarette licensure law. We're going to control for a vector of demographic characteristics, and then state-level controls, including macroeconomic conditions, some measures of how the COVID pandemic differentially affected states across the US, and then a wide set of other tobacco control policies, because we want to disentangle the effect of a licensure law from a wide set of other combustible and e-cigarette tobacco policies that were enacted around the country over the time period. We'll also control for policies that may affect complements or substitutes to e-cigarettes, in particular marijuana and alcohol. Our model will also control for state fixed effects and year fixed effects, and in some specifications, census region by year fixed effects. So here are our main findings, regression findings. Column 1 presents results from our most parsimonious specification, limited controls. Column 4 includes our most saturated model with all of the controls I just mentioned. Column 4 is our preferred model, but you can see how the estimates change as we add controls. Any ENDS use in panel 1 refers to any prior day use of an ENDS product in the last month by a teenager. Frequent ENDS use is the use of an ENDS product on at least 20 of the last 30 days, and daily ENDS use is everyday ENDS use. The pattern of results suggests that the adoption of a licensure law has no effect on youth ends use. The magnitudes of the coefficients are small, and they're never statistically different from zero. This is suggesting that e-cigarette licensure laws are very ineffective at reducing youth ends use. How precise are our null or zero estimates? Well, with 95% confidence, the precision of our estimates allows us to rule out licensure law-induced declines in teens ends use of greater than about 3%. So that's a pretty precise zero for any prior month ends use. For more habitual use, we can rule out with 95% confidence licensure law-induced declines in teens ends use of about 7% or more. Okay? So this is a null paper. For some applied researchers, not finding statistically significant results is a disaster that they're worried about. I'm here to remind you that zero is a number two. This is an editorial statement on so-called negative findings, which means null results, by all of the major health economics journals in the world, including the Journal of Health Economics, the American Journal of Health Economics, the European Journal of Health Economics, and they are arguing strongly, against the notion of researchers sticking in a drawer and hiding results, not pursuing publication of results where they find null results. In fact, doing so, if journals didn't publish null results, that would encourage researchers to engage in data mining, specification searching, and other empirical strategies with the goal of finding stars somewhere. But zero's a number two. It's important for policymakers to know when a policy doesn't seem to have a statistically significant effect, and it's important for leading journals in the field to publish this work. Of course, the null results are more meaningful when they're precisely estimated. We're very happy to see the Journal of Health Economics take this editorial statement really seriously in publishing this important work. The rest of our paper is just documenting through a number of other empirical strategies that if we look at dynamic difference in difference models, that is event study analysis, we continue to find these null or zero results, including with the use of the newly developed difference in differences estimators. If we look at higher penalty licensure laws or criminal penalties associated with licensure laws or higher renewable fees, we don't find any evidence that licensure laws are significantly reducing youth ends use. It's always a big zero. One of the reasons we think is that informal social markets may help to insulate youths from the impacts of licensure laws. There's some evidence that licensure laws might just induce some teens to go get their e-cigarettes from somewhere else rather than buying them directly in a store. It's not surprising that there's relatively little evidence of spillovers to combustible cigarettes, given that we don't find a first stage effect on ends use. There's no effect on dual use of tobacco products either. And when we look at adults in the BRFIS, again, licensure laws don't seem to have any effect. So our conclusion is that we find very little evidence that licensure laws have been effective at reducing youth ends use, despite policymakers' hope that this could be an effective strategy. And I hope this paper sort of encourages you to maybe think about results that you find that are null results as not as a failure of research, but an important finding, just as important, sometimes more important than finding results where policies work. So thank you for listening to my talk. And now I want to turn things over to my tag team partner, Chuck Cordamont, who's going to present some work on e-cigarette flavor bans. Let me make sure I have.
Thank you, Joe.
Great.
Can everyone hear me okay? And I need to share my screen here, right? All right, here we go. Okay, screen share okay? Okay. All right, great. Well, thank you all for being here, for joining us. Joe gave screen share still okay, Joe?
It's on the conclusion slide, but otherwise.
Yes, but yeah.
Yes.
We're going to start with the conclusion and work backwards. That might be more fun.
I agree.
So, well, Joe just gave that was a master class in how to make zeros sound entertaining. So that was very nice. I might be borrowing some of those ideas for my future presentations. Fortunately, I have a little bit more than just zeros to share on this paper. Not that there's anything wrong with zeros, right? But so this is a study of the effect of e-cigarette flavor bans on tobacco use. A list of co-authors is there, Joe and others, and got the acknowledgement of regarding funding through global action and what that means. Those there. The so just to quick setup, and I'm gonna shorten some things to not to make sure I don't reinvent the wheel with the things Joe's already told us about. E-cigarettes, obviously a fairly new product, right? That's an important thing to keep in mind. 20 years or so, and took a while to reach kind of major popularity as well. And battery operated vaporizes a liquid. Most contain nicotine. The key aspect is there's no burning, nothing combustible, right? So really important to really our entire line of research here is the idea Joe had shared about potential substitutability. And the idea that the tendency is to think in a vacuum, right? That if you can do something, whatever it is, to reduce the consumption of a good that is bad for you, then that's a good thing. As economists, we're often emphasizing the idea that you have to look holistically. You have to consider all of the range of consequences, intended and unintended, that are going to flow downstream from whatever action you're taking. If you cut down on use of something that's bad for you, but replace it by using something that's even worse for you, then this is no longer a win, right? And so you have to have that holistic perspective. So with that in mind, and the potential substitutability that Joe told us about, which is generally confirmed by quasi-experimental studies of e-cigarette taxes and other regulations. What is the relative risk of harms of e-cigarettes compared to combustible cigarettes? And again, it's a new product. It's physically impossible to have evidence that's beyond 20 years, 20 years out with something that new. So you're not going to have the evidence base you'd have with combustibles. Generally speaking, and again, I'm saying a complicated literature very quickly here. Generally speaking, most experts would agree that e-cigarettes are less harmful than combustible cigarettes. Now, the question is how much less harmful. For example, on one end, you got the Public Health England, a very well-known expert review, concluding that e-cigarettes are only 5% as harmful as cigarettes, 1/20th as harmful. That obviously changes the game in terms of the way you would think about a lot of things, if that number is true. But of course, that was their best estimate, but it's uncertain. A recent survey of experts on average found that on average, the experts reported 37% as harmful as cigarettes. So that's quite a bit bigger number, but still a third or so of the harms of cigarettes, still means 2/3 less harmful. And so that's not nothing, right? So that's just kind of to set up the broader issue. And really it's the same setup as Joe was sharing, but the idea that, if you're, whatever it is that might be being done to try to drive down, vaping, what is it doing instead? Are this assumption that you're replacing vaping with nothing, maybe not necessarily true, right? And so that's going to motivate this work here. So we're looking at flavor bans. Flavor bans are, to me, and I'll forewarn you, we're going to get some pretty large effect sizes here. And I'm going to argue straight away that's a lot of times as empirical researchers, you see large effect sizes and you get worried that something's wrong. I'm going to argue in this case, large effect sizes are completely plausible. And here's my argument there. Well, teens who use e-cigarettes really like flavors. Okay. About 90% of youths who report vaping report that when they vape, it's flavors. And most common, the sweet flavors, right? Now, to understand, how kind of the nature of potential substitutability, cigarette flavors other than menthol have been banned for a long time, for 15 years. So you can't just go and switch to a fruit flavored cigarette, right? So that's again important when we think about substitutability. So when you think about 90% of youths are reporting using who vape are reporting flavored products. Well, if you take all flavored products and make them go away, the potential for the effect size is pretty big there, right? Well, let's suppose of every two youths who vape with flavors right now, if you take the flavors away, let's suppose one of them vapes, without flavors and the other stops vaping. Well, then you're going to get an effect size that's going to be on the order of 45 percentage points, right? So the potential is very, very big here. And I want to emphasize that going in. But again, the idea of substitutability, the more potential there is for a direct effect on vaping, that also increases the potential for substitutability to be larger, right? Okay, so what are the policy levers we're going to be utilizing here? As of our studies writing, 9 states and over 370 localities, generally cities or counties, had adopted e-cigarette flavor restrictions. And what we're going to do in this study is investigate the impacts of these restrictions on youth and young adults specifically. And, as I've kind of hopefully set up for you to be sort of anticipating here, what we're going to find is that youth and young adults reduce vaping, right? They do reduce vaping in response, according to some of our measures, in response to these flavor bans, but they might also increase smoking. And that's going to be particularly clear among young adults rather than youths. All right, so we'll dig in. Just really quick overview of the literature for the sake of time. Basically, prior to our work, you had 4 studies looking at e-cigarette flavor bans that were all using sales data, right? Scanner data, et cetera, Nielsen. And in at least 3 of the 4 cases, they weren't really looking at the whole range of laws. They were looking, for instance, the ban in Massachusetts, ban in San Francisco, 4 states. Here, there's more, but still not as many as we're looking at. So really, our launching off point and our contribution, I'd say our number one contribution is that rather than just looking at sales data, because that doesn't really tell you who it is who's changing behavior, we're going to zoom in on youth, right? We're going to zoom in on youth. Why? Because, that's where the particular health concern tends to lie. And then we're also going to look at a broader array of policies, the average effect across a broader range of policies, which hopefully gives estimates that are a little more generalizable. Okay, one quick point to make, just so it doesn't look like we're hiding this. Literally on one of these stranger stories of my research career that I won't get into, but too much. But literally the same day our paper came out on NBR, a very similar paper by different authors with literally the same paper title came out. And behind the scenes, they sort of asked us to differentiate our titles and to acknowledge each other and so on. But just nothing but a pure coincidence there. Unfortunately, they're finding that they do some things differently than us. We think both studies are important for different reasons, but by and large, they're finding results similar to ours. Okay, so to get into the data here, we'll cover this pretty quickly. It's similar data to what Joe described already. So the key thing to understand about our treatment variable is we only have state identifiers, right? But the policy variation isn't only at the state level, it's also at the local level. So how do you handle that? What you can do there is compute population weighted averages within the state, right? So if half the state has a flavor ban, half the state doesn't, you would code that as a 0.5, half in terms of population. So essentially that's what we're doing. Now there's hundreds of these laws and a lot of them are tiny, tiny cities that probably don't matter in an aggregate sense. So we're only kind of coding in the larger ones, but the results aren't really sensitive to doing that other ways. Okay, our data sets, as Joe already just talked about, national and state youth risk behavior surveys, school-based surveys. Main outcomes are e-cigarette and combustible tobacco use, and those are given, they don't give, exact details, but have you used any in the last 30 days, and then frequent and every day. So you've basically got 3 measures that kind of are increasing in terms of intensity. We also looked at, do flavor bans affect the source of obtaining e-cigs? Do they affect drinking and harder drug use? Some other outcomes. We found no results for those outcomes, which again are important. Zeros are important, but with a short presentation, I've elected to leave out those results. I can link to them if asked later on. Okay, then when we're looking at young adults and older adults, we're going to be using sort of a cousin of the YRBS, which is the BRFSS, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. And similar types of questions. So one thing to emphasize here, it's a fairly short study window. Why? Because that's when these surveys had the e-cigarette questions. They did have cigarette questions for longer, and I'll return to that point. Okay, just quick sense of the policy variation. By 2015, you really had no ends, another word for e-cigarettes, basically. 2015, you had really no policies. The dark black is the entire state, and then the lighter shades of gray for how much of the state, right? Then you had a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. By 2021, you have a decent amount of policy variation, the Northeast, and then a smattering of other states. So that's kind of where this identifying variation is going to come from. An important point to just make quickly, although we haven't really gotten terribly far in terms of how does this matter. All flavor restrictions are not created equal. Some, like Massachusetts and San Francisco, the policy that gets coded in here is a policy where they make all flavors of anything tobacco illegal. That includes menthol on cigarettes. In other cases, you've got flavor restrictions that only apply to ends, and they're going to allow menthol to stay in place. So you kind of have a range of intensities, and we're going to be estimating the average effect across all of that, at least at this point. Okay, so the empirical method it's basically your basic two-way fixed effects with some twists. Two-way fixed effects, meaning we have fixed effects for location, fixed effects for time. And so then the identification is going to be coming from how changes in how the timing of the implementation of flavor bans in different places correlates with the timing of changes in patterns of tobacco use. Two otherwise observably identical places, one gets a flavor ban, what doesn't, what happens to those outcomes, how do they change over time in response. So that's the basic intuition and idea here. We've got an array of individual and state level controls. The state level controls are really the trickiest piece here because there are so many other policies related to vaping and smoking, and they tend, it's the same sorts of states that tend to adopt the whole array of policies, generally at different times, but it's still that, you worry if you don't control for the other policies that you're going to have omitted variable bias. At the same time, you're worried if you control for all of them, the kitchen sink, you're going to have so much multicollinearity that the results won't be useful. So what do we do in that case? We try it all. We try it all sorts of different ways and show our results are robust. Okay. So we'll go through the, kind of go through some results quickly and emphasize the more important ones. This first, we're doing both OLS and logit models. This first slide is for current ends use. Okay, so this is the least intensive of the three measures. Just do you do any over the last 30 days? And what we see is no stars. Now, that's simplistic. We do see all negative signs, right? So on one hand, we see all negative signs, which is consistent with, the law of demand, essentially, as it applies to other things besides prices, but you make it harder or less desirable and you get less of something. So the negative signs are as predicted, but we see no stars, and these magnitudes generally are fairly small. So really no clear evidence of an effect on the probability of any ends use. But when we start turning to the more intensive measures, we see more. Again, if I had an hour and a half, we really drilled into these magnitudes, but basic thing to see, all the signs are negative and we got a lot of stars now. Okay, so there's more happening. To quickly talk about magnitudes, what I want you to see is that they're big as a percentage of the mean. If we look here at, say, column 5, the pretreatment mean 4%. So 4 out of every 100 teens at baseline used ends products frequently. Okay, then here we've got a 2 percentage point decrease on a base of about 4. That's 50% of the mean. Okay, there's a couple ways to look at that. One, that sounds pretty big. But as I've set it up before, I think it's actually believable in this particular case, even if it might not be in other cases. The other way to look at it is you've got a very small mean, a very small base rate. Anything at all is going to be a big percentage of a small base rate. So, you kind of take that with a grain of salt. This is in some sense like these news articles that drive me crazy, where it's like whatever thing increases your risk of cancer by 25% and everyone gets terrified. And then you realize, well, it's 25. It's an extremely, 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 extremely small probability that just went up by a really, really, really tiny bit. But because the base was so small, it's 25%. Right. And so
Chuck, just to know, we have like sorry, quick note, we have like 2 minutes.
All right, sure. So just, keep that in mind with the magnitudes. They're big, but, I think still believable. And, looking at it in terms of percentage may be a little misleading. Okay. All right, frequent. So turning then to the most kind of intensive measure every day, really a similar story. Effect sizes as a percent of the mean, similar, and we have a lot of stars, all negative signs. So all that to say, flavor bans seem to reduce vaping among teens. Sounds good so far. All right, well, let's turn ahead. Now, why do we believe these results? There's a whole ton in the paper, event study models, robustness checks, to convince you should believe those results. Not going to get into it here for time. Happy to talk more later. Okay. We look at heterogeneity across the different demographic bins. Not a ton of note here. So now we turn to combustibles, right? To smoking, to cigar use, where we might see some substitutability. To keep this simple, we have a giant table in the paper where we show there's really not much happening if we only look at the 2015 to 2021 sample, kind of inconclusive results. But as I mentioned earlier, for cigarette smoking, we can go back to 2011. And when we do that, we actually do find pretty sizable evidence of substitution. So it's sort of on the one hand, on the other hand, as far as those results go, but there's at least some evidence of substitution and fairly large relative to the mean. Okay, some evidence of heterogeneity with regard to current cigarette use. Some groups positive and significant, others nothing significant. So now quickly to turn to the BRFSS, which is kind of our secondary add-in analysis. Okay, so this is where we're zooming in on young adults, and what we see here is pretty big, effects here in terms of current ENDS use. 4.8 percentage points on a base of about 12. Less for everyday ENDS use, but these are still very big magnitudes. It's just apparently not precise enough to get significance. It's a pretty thin slice of the data, right? So by and large, we do see that vaping among young adults goes down in response to flavor bans. For adults 21 plus, basically all other adults, we see a big pile of nothing. Okay, so that's pretty important to contrast. Now to combustibles, we see here fairly clear evidence of substitution. 2.4 percentage point increase on a base of about 7. Okay, so that's not nothing by any means. So to wrap it all up and kind of pull it together, again, happy to talk in more detail about all the things that I kind of glossed over. We're finding this on the one hand, on the other hand, evidence, right? E-cigarette flavor bans reduce the more intensive measures of vaping by a lot. And they don't clearly influence smoking among youth, but they also don't clearly not influence smoking among youth. Kind of depends on which batch of results you buy. But they do seem to increase the smoking rate among adults by a substantial amount. And if you just take those magnitudes, take literally more than half of the amount of the drop in the vaping rate. In other words, roughly speaking, every two young adults who stop vaping, one of them is now smoking. So you can kind of do the math in terms of the relative harms and what that would mean. And so just the overall point is, yet again, this study contributes to the body of evidence showing that policies intended to drive down youth vaping can have benefits. They can be effective in achieving that aim, but they also can have unintended consequences. And it's really hard to talk about net effects, like which effect dominates, without more conclusive evidence about the relative risks, the relative harms from the two types of products. So I'll end there, and thank you all.
Thanks so much, Chuck. Appreciate it. And our final presenter, Caterina Muratori, is going to present some work on spillover effects of electronic cigarette taxes. Caterina?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Okay, is the sharing okay?
Yes, looks
Okay.
good.
Perfect. So to conclude the seminar, I'm going to focus on the impact of ENDS regulation on product other than tobacco. And in particular, I'm going to present this joint study with Professor Dave, Liang, McLean, and Sabia on the impact of end taxes on substance use, and in particular on marijuana use. Okay, so as underlined in previous presentation, since the arrival of ENDS product in the United States in the early 2000s, the use of this product among youth dramatically increased. But at the same time, the use of another product has dramatically increased, so the consumption of marijuana for recreational purposes, because in 2012, Colorado and Washington legalized marijuana for recreational purposes, and since 2012, 24 states and the District of Columbia has legalized marijuana for recreational purposes. So nowadays, marijuana is the most commonly used drug for recreational purposes. In 2021, around 20% of adults and 11% of youth reporting using marijuana in the last month. So both these substances may have potential health benefits and cost. As we already saw, increased access to e-cigarette have been found to curb combustible cigarette use, and generally experts say that e-cigarette are less harmful than combustible cigarette. And looking at marijuana, we know that marijuana use may allow consumers to treat a variety of painful symptoms and may also induce substitution away from other potentially more harmful behavior like problem drinking or opioid misuse. At the same time, both these substances can produce concerning effect. In particular, the increased access to e-cigarette may renormalize smoking, but also may have an unintended gateway effect on marijuana use and other substance use. Looking at marijuana, we know the frequent and heavier marijuana use have been found to increase the risk of respiratory disease, and in particular in the 2019-2020 EVALI crisis, the joint consumption of e-cigarette and marijuana leads to 68 deaths and nearly 3,000 hospitalizations for severe respiratory problems. Also, early initiation of marijuana has been linked to diminished brain function, increased risk of psychotic disorder, and increased risk of suicide behavior. And finally, the early initiation into marijuana more than tripled the risk for cannabis use disorder and serves a gateway to harder drug use. So also in light of this, contrasting effect of e-cigarette access, e-cigarette regulation have been increasing over time. The past two presentations focus on e-cigarette licensure laws and e-cigarette flavor ban. And now here in this study, we focus on one of the most commonly used tool to regulate e-cigarette access, which are e-cigarette taxes. So e-cigarette product may be taxed through an ad valorem tax on wholesale prices, which is an excise tax per unit or per fluid milliliter of liquid, or through a special sale tax. For this study, we use a standardized measure produced by Cotti et al. In 2021 that allow us comparability across states and time. And looking at this standardized measure, this measure ranges from $0.01 per milliliter of liquid in Wisconsin to over $2 in Minnesota. And as of December 2023, 31 states and the District of Columbia has adopted an end tax. So very briefly about the literature, the effectiveness of end taxes in reduces ends use has been widely documented, but study also found that end taxes may induce substitution towards traditional cigarette use. And there are some study looking at this relationship between tobacco and marijuana use, but found in very mixed evidence. To the extent of my knowledge, right now, there's only one other study looking at spillover effect of end taxes, and it's the study by David et al. Of 2022 that looks at the effect of end taxes on binge drinking and alcohol-related traffic fatalities. So this is one of the very first studies to look at the effect of end taxes on substance use and in particular on marijuana use. Knowing a priori what is the effect of end taxes on marijuana is not easy because two different channels may be in effect here. On one side, end taxes may increase marijuana consumption if e-cigarette and marijuana are economic substitutes. This means that if e-cigarette and marijuana are competing ways to attain the same kind of utility. So an increase in e-cigarette may lead to substitution towards vaping marijuana. On the other hand, end taxes may actually reduce marijuana consumption if there is an income effect. So if the introduction of end taxes increase the price of a cigarette and so reduce the income available to the consumer, that as a consequence has to reduce the consumption of other substances like marijuana. Can be a reduction also if these two products are economic complements. This may happen if vaping nicotine serves as a gateway to marijuana use, or if investing in a fixed cost of a nicotine vaping device reduce the cost of vaping marijuana. And we know from our data that the joint consumption of marijuana and e-cigarette is very common. And also if joint consumption enhances social capital acquisition, so if vaping is considered cool among peers, a reduction in e-cigarette in vaping e-cigarette may lead to a reduction in marijuana vaping. Finally, if the use of one product increases the height or euphoria of the other product, and if end taxes serve as a signal about the risk of vaping. All these effects may be we can kind of hypothesize the same kind of channel for other drug use other than marijuana, but we assume from the beginning that this effect, if it's there, it may be weaker because we focus on youth, and youth consume way more marijuana than harder drugs, and also joint consumption of e-cigarette and harder drugs is very uncommon, while the percentage of youth using both e-cigarette and marijuana is around 12% in our data set. So this is one of the first study looking at the effect of end taxes on marijuana and harder drug. We use 5 different data sets to establish this relationship. And we also try to descriptively explore mechanisms that could be at work. We find our study policy relevant as it can give evidence on possible spillover effect of end tax, and so be very informative for policymakers. The first 2 datasets that we use, 3 datasets actually, are state and national YRBS and Brofus that have been already described in previous presentation. From the YRBS, we take question on past 30-day e-cigarette use and past 30-day marijuana use, and we code each of these variables on e-cigarette use and marijuana use as taking value 1 if the person interviewed has used the substance at least 1 time in the past month. Then we take current e-cigarette use among adults from the Brofus to confirm our first stage relationship. And we add to this an analysis on the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which report marijuana and other drug use for the population age 12 and older. But this data set is aggregated at the state level, so we use prevalence rates. And finally, we use the treatment episode data set, which is a data set reporting admission to health facility for drug misuse. So it kind of reflects more intensive use of drugs. And again, we have the population age 12 and older. These are just a summary statistic of this variable that I'm going to skip for sake of time. And this is the kind of variation we're going to exploit in the study. So I start from 2010 because it's the year when the first state, Minnesota, implement an end tax. And throughout our sample period, we have 18 states and the District of Columbia implemented an end tax. So this is the kind of geographic and temporal variation that we're going to exploit in this study. Again, we use a 2-way fixed effect model. So we include state and year fixed effect, and this works as a generalized difference in difference. Our main variable of interest, our main policy variable is ends tax, which is this continuous measure of tax standardized as in Cotti et al. 2021 and is expressed in 2019 dollars. And our outcome variables are in turn e-cigarette use, marijuana use, and harder drug use. And then we add a set of individual and state level covariates that are mainly macroeconomic control and substance use policy. So before moving to our main effect, which is the effect of end taxes on marijuana and other substance use, we wanted to reproduce the first stage effect, which is the effect of end taxes on e-cigarette use that has already been established in our study, in other studies, but we wanted to be sure that was present in our specific data sets. So in panel 1, we use state YRBS, and in panel 2, national YRBS. And these different columns just includes different sets of control. So we're going to focus on column 6, since it includes all the possible control variable. But as you can see, results are pretty consistent across all columns. And we confirm what has already been established by the literature, that a $1 increase in net tax is associated with the decline in e-cigarette use, in particular with a 5.3 to 7.6 percentage point decline in e-cigarette use that translate in a 20 to 34% decline in ENDS use. Moving to our main analysis here, basically panel 1 just replicate the first stage effect using this specific sample. So the sample in which the question, there is no missing value for the marijuana question. So we have the same exact sample in panel 1 and 2, where we use 2015 to 2019 because, as already said in previous presentation, the e-cigarette question in the YRBS started being asked in 2015. And then in panel 3, we extend the sample to 23 to 2019 because the marijuana question have been asked in previous to 2015. So panel 1 just replicate the first stage and confirm it. And in panel 2 and 3, we can see that, again, I'm going to look at column C, the saturated model, and we see that a $1 increase in end taxes is associated to a 2 to 2.4 percentage point decline in marijuana use, which translates in about a 10% reduction in marijuana use when we look at the pretreatment mean of the dependent variable. And we assume that this results is pretty plausible since it is about 70% smaller than the first stage effect. These are we just wanted to confirm our results, and we're going to do this for all the results that we have throughout the paper. We use, on the left panel, we have a two-way fixed effect event study, that it's important both to confirm results, but also to show the validity of the parallel trend assumption of our two-way fixed effect model. And then since we are in the presence of heterogeneous and dynamic treatment, for every estimation, we also perform a stack difference in difference estimation to be sure that our results are not biased by heterogeneous and dynamic treatment. Then we want to move to other measure. In particular, we want to look at other substance use, cocaine, heroin, and meth. And in column 1, we just try to replicate our effect on marijuana on the NASDA dataset. And as you can see, the effect is confirmed for the population 18 and older, but it loses size and significance for the ages 12 to 17. But this is very plausible in light of the fact that this sample is very different from the YRBS sample because we have a lot of 12 and 13, and we don't have 18 years old. So this population is systematically way younger than our YRBS population. Looking at other substance, other the marijuana, we found pretty much no effect across all these measures. So for now, we find an effect of end taxes on marijuana, but not on other substances. We want to discretely look also at channel for what concern marijuana. So we kind of try to rule out a possible income effect. So the fact that the decrease in marijuana use is just lead to the fact that youth have less money to spend, and so they spend less on marijuana. And for doing that, we look at the consumption of some everyday goods. So from the Brufus and the YRBS, we take a question on the consumption of French fries, soda, beverages, juice, and so on, condom use. And we see that across all these measures, we find no evidence of a significant decline in any of this measure, and most of these results are also of opposite sign. Finally, we were also very interested in what margin of marijuana use is affected. So which are the users that are actually affected by this policy? And what we find is that is the light use of marijuana that is affected by ENDS taxes. That is very plausible. In fact, in column 1 and 2, when we look at marijuana use less than 3 times in the past month, And when we look at ever use marijuana, which should reflect more of an experimental use of marijuana, we find our results on marijuana use confirm. But when we look in column 3 and 4 to a more heavy use of marijuana, 3 more times in the past month and more than 10 times in the past month, results this coefficient tends to become smaller and insignificant. And this kind of results is confirmed in the TEDs in column 5 and 6, because the TEDs report admission into a facility for marijuana use. So they report very heavy use of marijuana, and we find insignificant results. Looking at other substances, again, we find all null results. We confirm all of our results using a lot of sensitivities and robustness tests, and also to give some small evidence on our hypothesized channel, which is a complementarity between these two goods. We also find that N-taxis leads to a very sizable reduction in the joint use of Ns and marijuana. So to conclude, in this study at the beginning, we just re-estimate this first stage relationship between N-taxis and N's use. And we confirm it both across youth and adults. And then our main results is that we find that a $1 increase in N-taxes leads to a 10 to 12% decline in marijuana use among youth and about 11% decline among adults 18 and older. We find that there's no really evidence of an income effect. And so we conclude that most likely e-cigarette and marijuana are economic complements. And finally, we find that these results, this effect of N-taxes on marijuana use are true for light and experimental use of marijuana, and there is no effect for more frequent marijuana use, marijuana-related drug treatment admission, or use of other drugs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katerina. I appreciate it. So we had some great questions in chat. We just have a couple of minutes to talk about a few of them. First, I want to direct one to Chuck. So we had a question about we found in the flavor ban paper some evidence of reductions in strong evidence of reductions in habitual N's use among youths, and evidence of a small substitution effect toward combustible cigarettes, especially for young adults. So the question was, should we be willing to live with that trade-off of preventing youths from sort of an on-ramp to tobacco and be okay with that substitution effect among young adults? How should we think about that trade-off?
Boy, that's a hard one. I mean, first of all, I don't think I have an answer that is sort of, I think we're in the realm of speculation here based on the available evidence, and I want to make that clear. And I have, I have opinions. There's a reluctance to sort of to speculate too much. I think maybe answer in terms of what are some other things we'd really like to know, to say with some more, to take it out of the realm of speculation. The on-ramp idea. So let me say a few things I am comfortable saying that'll sort of answer the question. Maybe the on-ramp idea is sort of based, as economists we think of substitutes and complements, and that's really the idea that they're complements rather than substitutes. So the idea that somebody, for whatever reason, vapes are more available, whatever is sort of exogenously induced to start vaping, down the line, do they then transition into smoking? And there's really two competing literatures, I would say, on this topic. One that we think is more credible than the other, right? So early, there's plenty of evidence or studies or whatever that are just correlational that can document that this behavior happens, right? That there are people who start vaping, and then from vaping they go into cigarette smoking. Document that behavior does happen, that people who start vaping are maybe statistically more likely to eventually use cigarettes than people who never start vaping. So that gives rise to this whole idea, which is where that's coming from, right? The on-ramp idea. But then, on the other hand, that's really not that informative if you actually kind of think through what's going on there, because it's not causally interpretable. So if vaping had never existed, like what's the counterfactual? Joe used that word earlier, so I guess I can too, right? What's the counterfactual? If e-cigarettes just did not exist, would those people have just gone straight into smoking? Stands to reason that would be likely in a lot of cases. Why? Because people who just have a taste, have a preference for nicotine, are going to be both more likely to vape and also separately, independently more likely to smoke, or have a less of a preference for health, or whatever you want to call it. So it's not, so just because there exist people who start vaping and eventually start smoking does not mean that the vaping caused the smoking, right? It just probably more often than not means that these people had a taste for nicotine and they were going to end up smoking one way or another. And that's, so how can we say that? Well, that brings to the other strand of literature, which is the one that Joe and I do a lot of work in, that we think is more credible and is causally interpretable, because we're leveraging underlying good as random variation underneath it to get around that causality problem, right? And so we're able to show that policy-induced declines in vaping or increases in vaping, we could say, to keep it consistent. If some policy were to increase vaping, then that doesn't seem to lead to increased smoking. In fact, the opposite, right? And so a policy that drives down vaping, if the on-ramp story was true, we'd expect a policy that drives down vaping to also drive down smoking, but that's really not what we ever see in these dozens of studies that have been done using these techniques. So I'm personally a little bit skeptical about the on-ramp idea. I think it's based on kind of flawed science. And that's where I am on it. But, we definitely need to know more to say more absolutely.
So another question I just want to raise, and this may have to be our last because we are running low on time, is so in the licensure paper, we had a bit more of a discussion about the informal social market, which seems to play an important role, especially for youths in access to e-cigarettes. And a question about how the informal market sort of differentially may interact with policy. I mean, one could think about different price pass-through or tax pass-through rates when we're talking about ends taxes to youths who typically get their e-cigarettes in different ways. How do flavor bans sort of interact? So one question that arose is, hey, maybe the informal social market you think is sort of playing a role with licensure laws and helping insulate youths from the effects. Why not flavor bans? How should we be sort of thinking about this? I guess this is all kind of getting at the mechanisms, right? Kind of, through which these policies are operating for youths. But I guess I'll just say it does seem a mistake not to think about the fact that teenagers who are vaping nicotine typically are not walking into a vape shop and buying them directly from a retailer. That's not what the data are telling us. So at least thinking through how those social sources are interacting with policy seems important. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, and that's well said. Thinking through it is absolutely important. Hard to go a whole lot further than that based on bodies of evidence, right? I'll say in our paper, the flavor ban paper, we do not find conclusive evidence. We do look at sources, right? And we do not find conclusive evidence that the sources are changing statistically, right? That doesn't mean they're not. It just means we don't have the statistical power to find whatever might be happening. So we don't see evidence that it's changing those sources. But it certainly can and could. One point I'll add, I mean, what you said, I agree completely with. One point I want to maybe add and add on to that because it's relevant for this discussion. Black markets, I mean, the products still have to come from somewhere. They're being made somewhere. So if you think of it that way, it's a lot easier. This is where this leads us is an argument for policies being at a higher level, if they're appropriate, being at a higher level of geographic aggregation. Okay. If I live in Lexington, Kentucky, it's not too hard to get out of Lexington, Kentucky. If Lexington, Kentucky, were to pass a flavor ban, that's probably not going to do a whole lot because it's very easy to then picture somebody's going across the county line and getting the flavored products because they can still get them there. And then they're coming back into high schools or whatever and selling them on a black market. And, and that's much easier to do. Now, if we said the entire state of Kentucky outlawed it, well, now someone's got to go outside the state of Kentucky, bring them back in or whatever. And that's still very possible, probably would happen to some extent, but it's harder, right? So it might happen to less of an extent. And if you keep going from there, national policies obviously are even harder to establish a black market and on and on. Now, that's of course if a policy is desirable to start with, right? And you want to kind of crack down on that. But this is certainly, the question is very important. And the existence of black markets absolutely could dampen any impact that you might see. And possibly that could be part of what's going on with the licensing study and why we don't find clear effects.
Last point to sort of Katerina, were there any differences sort of we found in the effects of ends taxes on marijuana use by the state of the policy environment surrounding marijuana, kind of an interactive effect between e-cigarette taxes and whether a state, for instance, had a recreational marijuana law? Were there any important differences uncovered there?
No, not really. It looked like the fact that marijuana is legalized or not does not really have an impact, and then may give some power to your point about informal channel and how people obtain products.
Well,
Like
even if it were,
marijuana.
yeah, no, that's a good point. And even if it were, recreational marijuana were legal sort of in the state for the population you're looking at, right? It's still, so it is an illicit kind of market sort of spillover to teenagers. It's still not legal yet for 17-year-olds to get marijuana in the United States. No, that's great. I really appreciate all your talks, and I guess we at this time we should bring the webinar to a close. So thanks to everyone who made the webinar possible, particularly Ida Urekli, Cliff Douglas, Meenal Drumhammer, and our panelists, Chuck Quartermanch, Katerina Muratori, and of course our very engaged audience. Thanks so much for all of the questions we've tried to answer as many as we could in writing as well. So thanks so much, and until our next Global Action webinar, we bid you farewell. Thanks.
Thank you all.